there are three forms of consent. There is informed consent, there is coerced consent, and there's forced consent on this spectrum. Okay, so let's start with informed consent. Informed consent is where you have the mental and legal capacity to consent to something. The legal capacity is in relation to your age. Now that can change from country to country, but usually it's around either 16 or 18, something like that. There must be full disclosure of all the factors involved. Full disclosure. And it must be honest. You must then understand all of those factors that are involved. Ask questions, they must be answered truthfully. And fourthly, you agree to them. You voluntarily agree to them. That's informed consent. And to give you an example of that, because I think a lot of people misunderstand what consent is about, particularly in a sexual context. So let's say that I'm British and I like a cup of tea, so let's have a cup of tea. I ask if you want a cup of tea. Yes, I want a cup of tea. I go and make you a cup of tea, I bring it back to you and you change your mind. You say either, oh, you know what, I changed my mind, don't want a cup of tea now, or I'd like a cup of coffee instead. But I've made you a cup of tea, that's what you wanted, that's what you said, that's what you agreed to before. But I've changed my mind. Fair enough, you can change your mind. That's not a problem. I then don't force you to drink that tea. Okay, I make you a cup of tea, I bring it back, you're asleep. I don't force you to drink that cup of tea. So what you need to do is you need to take into consideration change in circumstances. So just because you've given your consent at one point, based on certain facts, you can change your mind, whether those facts change or not. But also if those facts change, you can also change your mind. And that is acceptable. And it also does not mean that just because you've accepted a cup of tea this week, the next time I see you, you're going to be presumed to want the same cup of tea. And that's very much the same with in a sexual content. Just because you may have agreed to certain sexual acts on a certain occasion doesn't mean that then you will automatically be presumed to consent to those acts to perpetuity. Okay. Let's then change to forced consent. This is really quite straightforward because in law, if there is any physical or sexual abuse, if any misrepresentation as to the facts, any fraud, legally, if you consent, it is not regarded as a legal consent, so it's vitiated automatically. So you cannot consent to those situations. The grey area, of course, comes in the middle in between, and that's coerced. And there have been a number of cases where the daughters are brought up to believe that the sex industry is their only choice. There's high demand, therefore there are easy jobs to do, to get, and it's good money. Is that sufficient to be regarded as coerced? Now, certainly if they don't believe that there's any other choice, then yes, that would err on coercion to be forced. So there are circumstances that can be addressed and can be assessed to be coerced to the point of being forced, and in those circumstances, that would be non-consensual acts. However, there is another body that regards socioeconomic factors such that everybody has to work. There are many people who don't want to work, but they have to. And this is something that I think a lot of people misunderstand. Migrants have to make these very difficult decisions. They have to assess their situation where they are, and they have to decide whether they stay or whether they go. Now, this is a tough decision, and these are very courageous decisions to have to make. So why should, therefore, their consent to making those decisions, to working in a different country in that industry, be either irrelevant or dismissed? And so, yes, perhaps it is a coercion because you have to take into these socioeconomic factors that you have to work. And if there are other choices, which sometimes there are, yes, there's a sex industry, but there's also agriculture, there's construction, there's the fishing industry, there's the garment industry, there's service industry, all of the service industries. So there are choices. So this would perhaps be regarded as coerced, but also informed. and therefore relevant and valid consent.